Good morning, you smiley faces. Great to see you all here. Thanks for getting up and coming to the introduction session. My wife and I were walking over, and she said, "How do you think it'll be?" I said, "Well, at least the speakers will be there." I'm not counting in case there are some who aren't. Uh, Needless to say, we asked the director, Condoleezza Rice. Condi is the only thing I've ever called her, and I was once introducing her, and I said, "What do I do?" I just said Condi, and then I kind of stuttered, and she said, "It's okay." That's the kind of person Condi is, and she asked us to welcome you on her behalf. I'm not sure if she's at the Masters yet, but that may be where she's headed. So you can always count on a golf game trumping most anything that we would do here. And that's good, because when she's there, she's usually also schmoozing and bringing in some money. And for senior fellows like us and others in the audience, that's what we like. A couple of years ago, I think Nick came up with the idea, but I'm here first, so I'll take credit, of we ought to do a little more on the environment. Both of us, I think it's fair to say, are environmental economists. So we chatted and came up with this idea of markets versus mandates for the environment. And went to Condi, and Condi is the quintessential entrepreneur in that she hears a good idea and get out of her way because she's going to run. And she, not for president, so we gave her this idea, and she just, go for it. And my young partner keeps saying, "Do we have money for that?" And I said, "Did somebody tell you can't do it?" And he said, "No." And I said, "Then we must have money. Keep going." So, and this conference was one of the things we proposed to her, and she was excited about it and excited about the project generally. And we are off and running. This is the second annual Markets versus Mandates Conference, or MVM as it's come to be called for shorthand. And we note I said annual. That suggests that there will be more to come. So, and if you can't from your seat see the difference between his age and my age, as there's more to come, you'll know who's going to be the more. And I'll stagger up to the stage and hopefully contribute. And I think the reason that Markets versus Mandates is such a good title and good approach to the issue of the environment here at Hoover is most people would just look at markets versus mandates and say, well, we don't need to talk anymore. We know what the answer to that one is. It's always markets. And yet, here at Hoover, I think the thing that distinguishes this institution from other think tanks is people here don't say, well, I think markets work better. And then, well, that's your perspective. I think that mandates work better. I don't think the Hoover Institution is a think tank. It's not a place where we utter what we think, although hopefully we do think, but we do research, and we think about our issues in the context of some framework, which Nick and I will try to lay out a little bit in the introductory remarks here. But we do the research then that leads us to say, this is why this happens. This is why this might be better than the other. Nick and I also direct a project on renewing indigenous economies, looking at especially American Indian issues, but other indigenous economies. And it's that we get accused of, oh, you think that Indians should have this, or we should do this for Indians, or might say to Indians. And Nick especially has a great lecture in which he says, we've done the research. It's what it shows. If you want to show us some research that disproves what we've done, that's fine. So this program, Markets versus Mandates, is truly about doing research to focus on these issues. And one of the reasons we took it on is I loved, I don't know how many of you remember Kermit, but Kermit used to say, it isn't easy being green. And it's not easy being green. And it's not because, if you've ever had an economics class, especially from me, you know the next words that I'm going to utter are tradeoffs. And so, wouldn't it be wonderful to have electric cars? But to have electric cars, You have to have electricity. To have electricity, you have to produce it. How do you produce it? Well, there are lots of different ways, but a lot of things happen in the background, and those are some of the trade-offs. And that's why it isn't easy being green if you really want to look at the overall picture. In my case, for an electric car, I live in Montana. When it's 25 below and I have to drive across the state, an electric car doesn't look very appealing at all. We had a big cold snap recently in Bozeman, where Monica and I live. There are many, many more Teslas than there used to be, as that the people who feel they're green are showing their greenness with a Tesla. And that cold snap led a lot of people to say, ew, maybe this doesn't work so well, because as soon as you turn that heater on, you're sucking the battery down, and that's one of the trade-offs. So it isn't easy being green. And as I was looking through issues that we might talk about that are current, I found out that wolves, well, I found it online, but I also know, because Nick is an expert in this topic, and we'll talk more about it later, but wolves are back in Europe by huge amounts. Nick can talk about the numbers more than I can. But the wolves are back, and they're back in large numbers. There are more wolves in France than there are in Montana and Yellowstone, where we reintroduced them. And when I thought of this in the context of trade-offs, it took me back to the way I used to speak about this topic, and I dug out one of the hats that I like to wear, and it's my rancher's hat. And the ranchers in Montana, and now the sheep producers in France, are not enamored with the fact that wolves are back. And when the reintroduction of wolves occurred, the people who wore this hat were, we had the optimal number of wolves? None. What are we doing putting them back into Yellowstone where they might eat our cattle? And there were bumper stickers, the only good wolf is a dead wolf, and wolves in the reticle of a hunting scope. We have to shoot wolves. We need to get rid of wolves. A friend of mine who was on the other side of this issue, so I'll put his hat on. The ranchers, so they're not happy, and it isn't easy being green if you have to talk to them. And my friend who wore this hat, and his environmentalist hat, was trying to convince ranchers that they should, embrace wolf reintroduction, because they were the last missing link in the ecosystem. And Hank told the story of going to a meeting at a local cafe in a small town where there was lots of ranchers, and he got up in front of the audience, all wearing this hat, and they said, "Ain't nobody killed you yet?" And Hank knew he had a pretty tough sell to make to that audience. But that kind of illustrates why it isn't easy being green. There are trade-offs. You want wolves back? Well, not everybody is going to embrace that idea. And so the question becomes, what, as we think about wolves, and when you see this picture, you know why the ranchers say, "Ain't nobody killed you yet." So as we think about wolves, the economists say, well, this is really simple, All you need to do, and I used to teach economics, so I put my teaching hat on, my economics hat, and my class always understood, if I ask a question and they were kind of, what do we say, I would raise my hands as if teaching the choir, and it was, if the marginal benefits are greater than the marginal cost, do it. And so, wolf reintroduction, well, just calculate the optimal number. If the marginal costs are greater than the marginal benefits, then get to the E star. How much pollution should we have? If the marginal benefits are greater than the marginal cost. So then economists make a good living then going out there and estimating those marginal costs and marginal benefits and finding E star. Believe it or not, everybody doesn't beat a path to our door to see where E star is. So the question really that we want to address and do address in this program is, how do we get there? And our colleague at Hoover, my favorite person, all due respects to my other colleagues, is Tom Sowell. And this quote from Tom Sowell, I think, just kind of captures the essence of the answer to how do we get there? And he emphasizes, and the word I should probably put in bold print is incentives. What are the incentives? What are the incentives to get to if the marginal benefits equal the marginal cost? And one of our heroes, my heroes for sure, but a hero in economics to most people who study the question that Tom asked, is Ronald Coase, who won a Nobel Prize and was, as a result of an article he wrote, people have developed what, he didn't put it this way, but what's called the Coase theorem. And he, basically what he said was, under the right conditions, parties competing for these resources, do we get to have wolves or cattle, wolf-free places for cattle to graze, will be able to negotiate an economic optimum. So Hank Fisher and the ranchers ought to be able to figure this out, according to Coase. But the question was really, what are the right conditions? And Coase was very much a researcher. He wanted to really get into the nitty-gritty and find out under what conditions, what are they? Do we get the optimal amount through this negotiation? And he understood that sometimes, so that's the market side, the negotiation, sometimes we don't always get to that optimal solution, and it may be necessary to have mandates, have other ways of achieving these ends. And that, again, I think captures what this program is about, what the markets versus mandates program generally, and this conference is about. How do we balance these two? How do we find, do the right conditions exist for markets? And do we have, if not, do we need mandates? And then there's always the question of, do the mandates work? And I'll close with one more thing I taught my students, I think, to understand. In fact, we were at a local cafe, and there was a three-piece cowboy band singing, and I said, I think that one up there playing the bass is one of my old students. And I went up, Professor Anderson. And I guarantee you he would remember from my class that I always said, when somebody would say, we ought to do something, I'd say, and then what? And so if you take away from this marginal benefits, marginal cost, and then what? Always ask that question, and that's what we do with respect to mandates. And with that, I'll turn it over to Nick to tell you, and then what? Nick Parker.
Thank you, and I'm happy you put that quote up by Thomas Sowell, which I think is the perfect description of this program. It reminds me of another quote from a 18th century writer named Ambrose Bierce. And Ambrose Bierce defined an economist as a scoundrel, so good start, whose faulty vision causes him to see the world as it is rather than how it ought to be. And so I think Thomas Sowell was such a scoundrel. Terry certainly is. And we want to see the world as it is in this program, but beyond that, we do want to imagine how it could be with different sets of policies. So I want to highlight two examples from a paper that I've written on the origins of America's first environmental agencies, to highlight how mandates have helped America deal with some of its trickiest environmental problems. So the image on the left depicts market hunting at the turn of the 20th century during America's age of extermination. So many wildlife species under threat because of commercial markets. The image on the right depicts Los Angeles and smog therein around 1950 or so. So these problems resulted in part because the transaction costs of dealing with them through markets were extremely high. So this is a case for mandates. In the case of wildlife, you need a bunch of landowners to negotiate with each other to make contracts to restrict hunting. And the transaction costs of doing that were obviously high. I'll note they were high in part because of a form of an unnatural transaction cost. The government failed to enforce rights of trespass. So you could have had more private markets for wildlife conservation had those property rights been in place. But clearly the transaction costs of business owners and car drivers of negotiating for cleaner air would have been quite high as well. So this is an environment that set the stage for mandates to be necessary in some degree and potentially successful. So the figure on the left shows the rise and decline of sulfur dioxide. And the important point here is the decline starts coincident with the Clean Air Act, which was passed in 1970. And the Clean Air Act was likely successful because the benefits were quite a bit greater than the costs, according to most estimates. And you hear some about that in the next session. The figure on the right is stunning to me. It shows deer, the ubiquitous deer that there's about 34 million of today in the US, plummeted to numbers under 500,000 around the turn of the century. So deer, white-tailed deer, believe it or not, were at the risk of being extinct. And the regulations for deer populations, state wildlife agencies began to form around 1900. They banned commercial hunting and they regulated recreational hunting. And so, you know, it appears to be another example of a successful set of mandates. So mandates can work under different conditions, but they have lots of drawbacks. And so I have the title Too Successful here. I mean, the continued growth of deer populations actually highlights a more general failure of regulatory mandates. So there's overabundant deer in lots of places. 34 million deer means there's 1.5 million in Wisconsin where I live. There's more deer than people in a lot of places, and this has caused all kinds of damages. Deer are involved in the spread of disease, and they're involved in sometimes fatal deer vehicle collisions. So I speak from personal experience. This is my vehicle and my accident. Nobody was hurt except the animal. But the broader point is this kind of tunnel vision that regulatory agencies can have, causes them to be rigid and flexible, static, and not adaptive to new conditions. There's, you know, different approaches that can mitigate this particular problem. Wolf populations could mitigate deer vehicle collisions. Commercial hunts could as well. But agencies are really resistant to any kind of change. So very static approaches that you do see with mandates and regulatory approaches. So Coase has a nice balanced paper in the problem of social cost, and he talks about the presumed failure of markets under high transaction costs, although he never used that term, he never used market failure. But he talks about the costs of government administration. He says it can be extremely costly because there can be unintended consequences. And some of those unintended consequences are in fact quite difficult to see, but can be large. So Terry and I could give you a long list of unintended consequences of mandates. Here's a preview. The Clean Air Act, which I just described, benefits exceed the costs. One of the modern costs that hasn't been accounted for is the Clean Air Act reduces the ability of people to engage in prescribed burns. So if you can't engage in prescribed burns because the Clean Air Act says that's a temporary surge in air pollution, then obviously you have more wildfire tinder. You have a higher probability of catastrophic fires later on. Plastic bans for carryouts at grocery stores, like are used in California, have caused consumers to substitute to other forms of plastic, including trash bags. In some cases, that's increased the overall use of plastic. Fracking bans have increased the use of coal, reducing air quality near power plants. And the National Protection Act has frustrated some of the energy transition because there's regulatory procedures that need to go through for transmission installations. So lots of examples of unintended consequences. I think you'll hear more through the course of the day. So given the kinds of costs of mandates, regulatory approaches, the rigidity, even environmental groups have recognized the value of alternatives to mandate, regulate, and litigate. This article, it's about 20 years ago now, from the Economist magazine, appealed to environmentalists to consider that market forces could be their best friends. And some environmental groups have heeded that call. We could have a longer list, but there's groups like the Environmental Defense Fund that says it tries to find non-confrontational collaborative approaches. The Nature Conservancy, which says it examines every problem through environmental lenses or through an economic lens, so recognizing the landowners do bear costs if wolves are reintroduced, so what kind of incentives can you provide for wolf owners or for landowners to accommodate wolves? Well, you could compensate them, you could set up wildlife cameras and pay them if wolves are present on their land, and pragmatic environmental groups are doing those kinds of things. That's different than regulating, mandating, and litigating. So I've warmed you up for this table, and I promise we won't spend the next half hour on it. This is a draft table in a book that Terry and I are working on, and the table says making room for economic environmental gains. So, pure market activity, which is shown at the bottom with property rights and trade, is not always feasible, it's not always desirable, but in general, what is desirable is movement away from the top and towards the bottom. So on the top, there's command and control, in which mandates set goals and mandates dictate how those goals can be achieved. Early versions of the Clean Air Act do that. Certainly bans on gasoline-powered vehicles do that. So there's just very little room for innovation from entrepreneurs to do new things to improve the environment, to do more environmentally than what the command and control prescription dictates. So if you move to cap and trade, for example, you allow at least markets to determine methods for achieving. Cap and trade programs lower the costs of achieving certain goals. And if you move all the way down to markets, you open the possibility that innovations like fracking, which were inspired for reasons unrelated to regulatory mandates, could clean the air, just for pure market reasons, for the desire to capture economic surplus, to capture profit. Lots more clean air locally around power plants. People are healthier because of fracking and a reduction in CO2 emissions. So in general, movement down this table allows for more environmental entrepreneurship, and it allows for more freedom. And I think that's the big trick of this program is, can we find, skip this one, can we find approaches to environmental problems that enable individual freedom, economic gains, and environmental improvements? As Kermit the Frog said, that's not easy.
I'll just leave the conclusion slide up and comment very little because Nick has said much of what's there. But we want to document the cases, do research, and find the cases where markets can work and are working, and be very cognizant of cases where mandates may help, but also ask the and then what question. And the favorite picture I found that I think captures and then what, back when there were lots more debates, they rage on really in many cases, but over what we should do with the black-tailed prairie dog. And the Endangered Species Act is, there was a bumper sticker, shoot, shovel, and shut up if you had an endangered species around. But we really make the endangered species the enemy with this, and that's the and then what question. If you mandate that you have to change the way you operate your ranch or farm or your business to save a species, you make them the enemy. So this program, as Nick said, is all about finding the ways that work to steal that from the Environmental Defense Fund. And with that, we are on time, but we'll give a chance for one or two questions and cut into the other people's time because Nick and I have the property rights to the stage. Any questions before we...
We're willing to sell.
For sure. Well, if there are no questions, we'll turn it over to the important question: what are the benefits and what are the costs? With that, thank you very much for coming this morning, for listening to us, but now we'll turn it over to the next panel and talk about that all-important question to economists, but mostly to no one else. But so thank you very much.